When I first bought the cabin by the lake, I thought I had stumbled into paradise, a slice of earth so tranquil that even the constant pressures of work and city life seemed to evaporate the moment I drove down the winding gravel road that led to my property, the smell of pine and the distant shimmer of sunlight on water soothing every weary nerve in my body. And in that instant, I swore to myself that I would protect this place no matter what. The lake wasn't just some body of water for me, it was a legacy left behind by my grandfather who had taught me how to fish along its banks, how to respect nature, how to recognize the rhythm of the land that gave life and demanded care. And even though the years had changed everything around it, the creeping rise of property developments, the arrival of an overly ambitious homeowners association, and the influx of people who looked at the lake as nothing more than a backdrop for their vacation homes, it still held the same soul, still whispered the same stories in the wind that rattled through the cattails at dawn, still carried the same silver blue promise in its depths as it had when I was a boy learning to cast a line for the very first time. Back then, I didn't imagine that my decision to fish in those waters, a right I thought beyond question since the property deed included clear mention of riparian access, would ignite a battle with an HOA so blinded by control and arrogance that they would stoop to poisoning the very lake that fed not only the fish, but their own faucets, their sprinklers, and their very existence. But as is often the case with people obsessed with power, short-sightedness becomes their greatest weakness, and before long their greed would unravel in ways they couldn't anticipate. Though at the time I was simply enjoying the peace of the early mornings, sitting on the small wooden dock my grandfather and I had built, the boards weathered gray with age, my line dropped lazily into the calm surface, watching the concentric ripples spread out as dragonflies buzzed above the reeds. It wasn't until my second week after moving in that the first signs of tension emerged when a sharply dressed woman named Diane, whom I would later learn was the president of the HOA, strode up the path to my dock with two men in polo shirts following like bodyguards, her high heels clicking absurdly on the gravel as she raised her sunglasses to peer down at me like I was some trespasser squatting on land I didn't own, and with a practiced smile, she introduced herself, speaking in a tone that dripped with feigned politeness, telling me how the community didn't appreciate individuals fishing in the lake because it disrupted the aesthetic harmony they were trying to maintain. I stared at her, half amused and half stunned, because to me the lake wasn't a piece of decor, it was a living system, a habitat, a source of food and peace, and besides, my deed was ironclad proof that I had every legal right to fish there whenever I pleased, so I politely told her that I intended to continue enjoying the lake as I always had, which caused her expression to harden, the mask slipping just enough for me to see the disdain beneath, and she warned me that rules were rules before turning on her heel, and leaving me with a sense that this was far from over. Over the next few days, small but deliberate incidents occurred that made it clear the HOA wasn't going to let me be. They mailed me notices claiming I was in violation of community policies. They left pamphlets on my doorstep about maintaining the integrity of shared resources, and one evening I found a sign hammered into the ground near my driveway stating "No fishing HOA" enforced in bold red letters, which was laughable since the property and lake access belonged to me, and no HOA charter extended that far. But I ignored it, reasoning that if I gave them the reaction they wanted, it would only escalate. Still, there was something unsettling in the way they operated, a quiet but insidious sense of entitlement, as if they truly believed the lake existed solely to serve their curated lifestyle rather than the ecosystem it had always been. And one dawn, as I set out with my fishing pole, I noticed the water had a strange sheen across its surface, not the usual play of sunlight, but something oily, unnatural, and my gut told me this was no accident, though at the time I didn't fully grasp the extent of what had been done, nor the consequences it would carry for everyone who depended on that water, because what the HOA didn't understand, or maybe had forgotten in their eagerness to control everything, was that the lake wasn't just a pretty view from their patios, it was the very heart of the water supply that fed into their underground pumps and filtered through their systems, and in poisoning it to spite me, they were setting in motion a chain of events that would return to them in the cruelest way. possible, but in that first moment, as I crouched by the dock to scoop a handful of water and sniff its bitter chemical tang, I knew only one thing for certain. The battle over this lake was about to become a war, and I was not a man who backed down when family legacy, land rights, and nature itself were under siege, no matter how many slick pamphlets, legal threats, or hollow smiles the HOA threw my way. The very next morning, after I discovered that strange sheen across the lake's surface, I woke earlier than usual, restless from a night spent replaying Diane's smug face and the audacity of the HOA, thinking they had some authority over me or my land, and I went straight down to the dock with a flashlight in hand to get a closer look before the sun rose high enough to burn away the evidence. As I shined the beam across the shallows, the reflection revealed a thin film stretching across the water, shimmering with unnatural hues of green and orange, the kind of colors you only ever see when motor oil spills onto asphalt during a rainstorm, and my stomach sank because it confirmed what my nose had already told me, that someone had deliberately introduced chemicals into the water, and given the timing, it didn't take a genius to figure out who would benefit from it. The HOA had been pestering me relentlessly about fishing, their obsession with maintaining some contrived visual harmony, outweighing any consideration for the actual health of the environment. So I knew this was a targeted act, an attempt to make the lake unfishable, to poison the very heart of what connected me to this place, and I remember crouching low on the dock, running my fingers along the surface, and pulling them back coated in slick residue, feeling the fury build inside me like a storm. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about the arrogance of people who thought they could bend nature to their will, who believed they could take away something as timeless and essential as a body of water simply to win a petty dispute. And I promised myself right then that I wasn't going to let it slide, not when my grandfather's legacy was bound up in this lake, not when every childhood memory of fishing, swimming, and sitting by the fire afterward was tied to its existence, and certainly not when I had the legal right to protect it. But before I made any moves, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with, so I collected a small sample of the tainted water in a mason jar and set it aside, intending to take it to a friend in town who worked as a lab technician, someone who could test it discreetly and tell me exactly what kind of poison I was up against. Later that day, after a quick call and a short drive, I handed him the jar, explained the situation without going into too many details, and he promised to get back to me within a few days, though his expression tightened when he smelled the sample, muttering under his breath that it was definitely not natural. Driving back, my anger simmered under the surface, but so, too, did a sense of grim amusement, because the HOA had failed to realize something crucial. This lake wasn't just for my fishing trips or their picturesque backyard barbecues, it was the central reservoir feeding into their very own water supply system, piped underground to their homes and sprinklers, filtered and distributed like some gift they believed they controlled. And if the chemicals in the water were as bad as I suspected, then every single one of them would soon be dealing with consequences far worse than having to see me casting a fishing line on a quiet morning. Still, I didn't want to wait passively, so I began documenting everything, taking photos of the oily sheen, filming videos of dead insects floating belly up near the shore, and writing down dates and times of every strange occurrence, because if the HOA thought they could bully me with letters and intimidation, they were about to discover that I was methodical, stubborn, and more than willing to fight back with evidence. And as the days passed, sure enough, things started happening. Neighbors began complaining about odd smells in their tap water, one even mentioning at the local diner that his kids had broken out in rashes after playing the sprinklers, and though no one had connected the dots yet, I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth became undeniable. I kept fishing in the meantime, not because I could actually catch anything, the fish had gone scarce, and the ones I did see were sluggish, their movements unnatural, but because I knew it irritated Diane and her clique every time they saw me on the dock with a pole in hand, a living reminder that their petty little war wasn't over, and every time Diane walked by with her arms crossed, glaring like a hawk, I'd tip my hat and wave, smiling wider the angrier she looked. Eventually, the test results came back from my friend, and his voice on the phone carried a note of alarm. He confirmed the presence of herbicides and industrial solvents, the kind often used in landscaping, but highly toxic to aquatic life, substances that could seep into the soil and contaminate not just the lake, but the groundwater itself if left unchecked. And his warning was clear. Anyone drinking that water over time would suffer for it, their health compromised, their systems weakened, their trust in the purity of their supply shattered, and I realized that what the HOA had done wasn't just reckless, it was catastrophic. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a strange calm settle over me because now I wasn't just some stubborn fisherman defying their made up rules. I was a man with proof that they had jeopardized their own lives, their families, and the community they claimed to protect, and I knew how to use that to my advantage. Still, I didn't rush to confront them directly because strategy mattered, and I wanted the HOA to feel the slow weight of their actions pressing down on them until they cracked. So instead, I waited, fishing on the dock, as usual, watching, listening, and smiling to myself every time another neighbor grumbled about cloudy water, foul tasting coffee, or pets refusing to drink from their bowls. Because each complaint was another nail in the coffin the HOA had built for themselves, and all I had to do was bide my time, gather my evidence, and be ready when the collapse finally began. By the time a week had passed since I first noticed the poison glistening on the lake's surface, the situation had begun to unravel in ways even I hadn't expected. And though the HOA still strutted around with their chests puffed out and their phony smiles plastered across their faces, it was clear to anyone paying attention that something was seriously wrong in the neighborhood. The first real crack came during a community barbecue they hosted near the clubhouse, a gaudy building they had, erected to showcase their togetherness, when several families complained that the lemonade tasted metallic and bitter. And despite Diane's attempts to brush it off as a minor plumbing issue, the murmurs spread like wildfire, parents whispering that their kids had been complaining of stomachaches all week, dogs refusing to drink from bowls filled from the tap, and one elderly neighbor named Mr. Callahan even storming out in the middle of the gathering after angrily declaring that his doctor told him his sudden kidney issues might be related to chemical exposure. I sat back at the edge of the crowd that day, sipping my own bottled water and watching with quiet satisfaction, because the irony was rich. The very people who had conspired to ruin my lake and my fishing were now slowly poisoning themselves, their arrogant power games turning inward like a snake eating its own tail. And while I could have spoken up then, I chose not to, because I knew the truth needed to come crashing down on them with undeniable force rather than be dismissed as some bitter rant from the guy they saw as the neighborhood outsider. Instead, I kept documenting, taking photos of dead fish washed up on the banks, recording the slick rainbows of oil-like chemicals floating near the shore, and even capturing the way birds that once flocked to the lake now avoided it entirely, their calls absent in the early morning hours that had once been alive with sound. The silence was haunting, but it also strengthened my resolve because I understood that protecting the lake wasn't just about me or even about punishing the HOA. It was about ensuring that this ecosystem survived, that the land my grandfather had cherished wasn't completely destroyed by the hubris of people who saw themselves as landlords of nature itself. The breaking point came when the local paper ran a small article about mysterious contamination in neighborhood water systems sparked by complaints from a resident who had sent their water off to be tested independently. And though the article didn't name the HOA directly, it raised enough suspicion to send the board into panic mode, with Diane calling an emergency meeting at the clubhouse to reassure everyone that everything was under control. I decided to attend, walking in with my hat tipped low and my notebook tucked under my arm, and the moment I entered, all eyes turned to me with a mixture of disdain and unease, because though they didn't want to admit it, deep down they knew I was connected to the lake in a way they weren't, that I had a knowledge of the land and water that their rules and regulations could never replace. Diane stood at the front, her voice pitched high with forced cheer as she insisted that the water filtration system was functioning perfectly and that any odd tastes or smells were temporary fluctuations. But when she tried to dismiss the article as fear-mongering, I raised my hand and calmly asked if she could provide evidence to back her claims, specifically recent independent water quality reports, and the way her face froze told everyone in the room that she had nothing. A murmur rippled through the crowd. neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, and though Diane tried to pivot by attacking me personally, accusing me of stirring up trouble, and refusing to follow community guidelines, the damage was done because once the seed of doubt had been planted, no amount of smooth talk could erase the memory of foul-tasting water or rashes on children's arms. I didn't push further that night because I knew the power of patience, but I walked out of that meeting with the certainty that the HOA had begun to lose its grip, and it was only a matter of time before the residents turned on their so-called leaders. Meanwhile, I kept a close watch on the lake itself, noticing that the contamination seemed to ebb and flow, as if more chemicals were being dumped at intervals rather than a one-time event, which meant someone was actively maintaining the poisoning rather than it being a residual effect. And that revelation both enraged me and gave me an opening, because if I could catch them in the act, there would be no denying their guilt. So I set up a small camera hidden in the reeds by the dock, angled perfectly toward the stretch of shoreline where tire tracks had begun to appear late at night, and sure enough, after 3 days of waiting, the footage revealed two figures in HOA polo, shirts carrying containers and pouring them directly into the lake, their faces clearly visible under the beam of their own flashlights, and when I watched that clip, I felt a grim satisfaction settle into my bones. This wasn't just circumstantial evidence anymore, it was damning proof. Still, I didn't release it immediately because I wanted to see just how deep the hole they were digging for themselves could go, and besides, every additional complaint, every sick pet, every bad cup of coffee in the neighborhood only tightened the noose around their necks. All the while, I kept fishing from the dock, more as a statement than an activity, since the fish were dwindling, their populations collapsing under the chemical assault. But each time I cast the line into the poisoned water, I knew I was reminding the HOA that they hadn't broken me, that their tactics were failing, and that in the end, nature had a way of humbling those who thought themselves above it. And as autumn leaves began to drift across the lake surface, I sensed that the real showdown was drawing near, that soon the residents themselves would demand answers, and when that moment came, I would be ready to lay out everything, the test results, the photographs, the videos, and watch Diane and her cronies try to explain how their attempt to stop me from fishing had spiraled into a disaster threatening the very lives of the people they claimed to represent. It wasn't long before the pressure began to mount to the point that even Diane's polished exterior couldn't conceal the cracks, and the once smug HOA board found themselves fielding angry phone calls, answering door knocks at all hours, and listening to neighbors complain about everything from the taste of their morning coffee to the health of their children. Because by now the contamination wasn't just a mild inconvenience. It was an undeniable crisis seeping into every corner of their daily lives, and the very community that had once worshipped Diane's authority was turning against her. The first real explosion came when a young mother named Emily, whose toddler had been hospitalized after suffering violent bouts of vomiting, stood up at another emergency meeting in the clubhouse and demanded answers, her voice trembling with both fear and rage as she waved medical bills in the air and shouted that she wouldn't stand by while her child's health was sacrificed for aesthetic rules. And as her words rang out, the room erupted in a chorus of agreement, with residents shouting their own grievances, some accusing the HOA of negligence, others flat out asking if they had poisoned the lake themselves. I sat quietly in the back, notebook on my lap, watching with a sense of vindication as the chaos Diane had unleashed spiraled completely out of her control, her attempts to restore order drowned out by the rising tide of fury in the room, and though she kept insisting the water issues were external, that some outside factor must be to blame, I knew that her words were only digging her deeper into a pit of lies from which she couldn't climb. Still, I held my tongue because I wanted the evidence to speak louder than my accusations, and besides, the truth had a way of surfacing all on its own when enough people suffered under its weight. After the meeting, I returned to the lake and checked my hidden camera, finding yet another clip of the same two board members, one of them a smug man named Greg who strutted around like Diane's enforcer, pouring containers into the water, this time glancing nervously over their shoulders as though they feared discovery, and I felt a cold satisfaction knowing that soon their faces and actions would be impossible to deny. But what struck me most wasn't the anger of the residents or even the desperation of the HOA, it was the lake itself, struggling under the assault, its once clear waters now clouded with an unnatural, haze, the fish gasping near the surface for oxygen, the frogs eerily absent from the shoreline, the birds that once swooped low over the water now avoiding it entirely, and every time I stood on the dock, I felt both fury and sorrow because this place was more than a backdrop. It was a living ecosystem that had been entrusted to us, and watching it suffer for the sake of power games and pettiness was like watching a family member fall sick under deliberate harm. I began speaking quietly with a few neighbors, those who weren't blinded by the HOA's rhetoric, sharing what I had discovered without yet showing them the footage, and the reaction was immediate shock, anger, and above all, a desire for justice, because while they had tolerated the HOA's arrogance in matters of lawn heights and fence colors, endangering their families through poisoned water was something none of them could ignore, and soon whispers began to circulate that perhaps Diane and her board weren't just incompetent, but criminally negligent. Meanwhile, the HOA tried to double down, sending out glossy newsletters claiming that seasonal algae blooms were responsible for the discoloration of the water, an excuse so laughable that even the most compliant residents scoffed, because algae didn't explain the chemical taste in their mouths or the headaches after drinking from the tap, and it certainly didn't explain the pets refusing to drink water or the sudden spike in health complaints. The more they lied, the more credibility they lost, and as their grip weakened, I knew the time was drawing near for me to reveal everything I had gathered. One evening, as the sun set and cast long golden streaks across the lake's troubled surface, I sat on the dock and thought about my grandfather, remembering how he would sit with me in those same quiet moments, telling me that land and water weren't possessions, they were trusts handed down to us by those who came before, and that our job was to safeguard them for those who came after. And it was in that memory that I found my clarity, not just about exposing the HOA, but about restoring the lake, about making sure this wound inflicted by greed and arrogance didn't remain forever. The next day, I made copies of all my evidence, photos, test results, and especially the damning video footage, and prepared a packet that I would hand directly to the local environmental authorities, as well as to a lawyer friend in town who specialized in land and water rights, because I wasn't just going to rely on community outrage, I was going to bring the law crashing down on those who thought they were untouchable. But before I could even deliver the packets, word began to spread that several homes had reported water so foul-smelling that they couldn't even bathe in it anymore, and the outrage reached a fever pitch when Emily's toddler, the same child who had been sick before, was admitted again, this time with more severe symptoms, and the doctors openly raised the alarm about toxic exposure, a moment that ignited the community into full rebellion, with neighbors openly demanding that the HOA step down. Diane, however, was stubborn, clinging to her illusion of control, but what she didn't realize was that her power had already slipped away, and when the truth I carried finally came into the light, it would be the final blow, the undeniable proof that the very people meant to protect, the community had instead poisoned it from within, all because they couldn't stand the sight of a man fishing on his own land. The turning point came on a brisk Saturday morning when I finally decided it was time to take everything I had gathered and place it in the hands of people who could no longer ignore it. Because while the residents were already on the verge of rebellion, what they lacked was undeniable proof of who was responsible, and I had that proof neatly compiled in a folder thicker than a phone book. I woke before dawn, went to the dock to sit in silence for a while, letting the cool mist off the poisoned lake wash over me, and I thought about how far things had gone since Diane first marched down that gravel path with her smug warning about rules, never imagining that her attempt to strip me of fishing rights would end up poisoning her own community's lifeline. And as I sat there, I realized there was a kind of justice in it, though it didn't feel as sweet as I once imagined, because the lake was still suffering, the fish still floating belly up, and the birds still absent, and there's no undoing the damage so easily. Nevertheless, I stood, tucked the folder under my arm, and drove into town where my lawyer friend, a sharp-minded woman named Claire, was waiting with coffee already brewed and a determined look in her eyes, and when I laid the evidence out on her desk, photos of oily sheens, lab results confirming herbicides and solvents, and most damning of all, the footage of Greg and another board member pouring containers into the water, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long, low whistle, shaking her head at the sheer audacity of it. "This isn't just negligence," she said, tapping the papers with a pen. "This is criminal conduct, reckless endangerment at the very least, environmental crimes for sure, and depending on how many people have gotten sick, possibly even worse." Her words carried a weight that settled over me like an anchor because while I had been fueled by anger and stubbornness, hearing a professional lay out the potential charges transformed the entire conflict from a neighborhood feud into a scandal that could see people in handcuffs. Claire advised me to make two moves simultaneously. First, file an official complaint with the state's Environmental Protection Agency, and second, deliver a copy of everything to the local news station because while government investigations took time, the press would shine a spotlight that no amount of HOA spin could deflect, and I agreed immediately, feeling a surge of resolve as she made copies of everything and even offered to represent me if the HOA tried to retaliate with lawsuits. Later that afternoon, with the folder of evidence in one hand and my phone in the other, I drove straight to the offices of the local news outlet, a small building that had never carried a story more sensational than a county fair pie contest, and when I showed the editor the footage, his jaw dropped and he muttered, "This'll blow the lid off the whole place," already reaching for his notepad as though he'd stumbled onto the scoop of his career. Within 48 hours, the story was live. Homeowners Association accused of poisoning lake, endangering residents, and it spread like wildfire across the county, residents sharing the article on social media, angry phone calls flooding the HOA hotline, and even local TV picking it up for the evening broadcast, showing still shots from my footage with the board members' faces blurred until charges could be filed. The effect was immediate and electric, and by the time I returned to the neighborhood that evening, a crowd had already gathered outside the HOA clubhouse, holding up signs hastily made with black markers, chanting for Diane and the board to step down, some even throwing copies of the newsletter back onto the steps as if to spit in the face of all the lies they had been fed. I stayed on the edge of the crowd, watching as Diane appeared on the porch, her carefully styled hair disheveled, her voice trembling as she tried to shout over the angry mob, insisting that the reports were fake news and that I had fabricated everything to undermine her. But the residents weren't buying it anymore, not when their children had been hospitalized, not when their dogs had died from drinking tainted water, and not when their once pristine lake now reeked of chemicals every time the wind shifted. One man in the crowd shouted that his wife had been hospitalized with kidney problems, another yelled that his lawn had withered after he used sprinkler water, and a chorus of voices erupted demanding Diane's resignation, their fury palpable in the chilly evening air, and for the first time, I saw fear in Diane's eyes, the realization that her kingdom had crumbled, her control shattered, and that no amount of charm or intimidation could rebuild it. The next morning, I received a call from Claire telling me that state investigators had officially opened a case and would be sending a team to test the lake and the neighborhood's water systems, and that she had already filed motions to preserve all HOA documents and correspondence as evidence, effectively locking Diane and her cronies into a corner with nowhere to run. I couldn't help but smile when I hung up, not because I relished their downfall, but because it meant that accountability was finally coming, that the arrogance and cruelty which had poisoned both the water and the spirit of the community would no longer go unpunished. Yet, even in that moment of triumph, my gaze wandered to the lake outside my window, its waters dulled and lifeless under the autumn sun, and I felt a pang of grief because while justice was coming for the HOA, the lake itself had paid the highest price, and restoring it would take far longer than tearing down the liars who had tried to control it. Still, I knew one thing for certain. This fight wasn't just about exposing the guilty, it was about healing what they had broken, and I was prepared to dedicate myself to that cause, no matter how many more battles it would take. When the state investigators finally rolled into the neighborhood with their white trucks and official seals plastered on the doors, it felt like the cavalry had arrived, and though Diane and her board tried desperately to appear cooperative, it was obvious to anyone watching that they were scrambling, their usual arrogance replaced with barely concealed panic as uniformed officials in reflective vests walked the perimeter of the lake, set up testing stations, and began drawing water samples from multiple locations, their equipment humming quietly while residents stood nearby whispering anxiously, I stayed back, watching from my dock as they worked, the old boards creaking under me as I sipped my coffee, and thought about how different the scene was from just a few weeks ago, when the lake had been nothing more than a peaceful refuge for me. But now it had become the center of a scandal so large that reporters were even showing up, their cameras pointed toward the poisoned water, capturing shots of dead fish along the shorelines and the angry residents waving their medical bills in protest. It was surreal to watch a place I had loved since childhood become headline material, but I reminded myself that this was necessary, that shining light on corruption and arrogance always meant dragging ugliness into the open, and I steeled myself for the next phase, because exposure was only half the battle, restoration was the other half, and that would be far harder. Over the next several days, the investigators conducted their work methodically, interviewing residents, combing through HOA records, and even visiting me on the dock to ask questions, to which I gladly showed them my notes, photographs, and most importantly, the footage of Greg and the other board member pouring containers into the water, their faces illuminated by their own flashlights. When the lead investigator saw the video, he didn't even hide his reaction, muttering under his breath, "That's damning," before asking me to provide a copy for their official files, and in that moment I felt the weight of vindication settle firmly on my shoulders. This wasn't just me fighting anymore, it was the state itself recognizing the truth and preparing to act on it. Meanwhile, the community itself had descended into open revolt, with residents refusing to pay their HOA dues, lawn signs sprouting up that read, "Resign Diane," and "Clean water, not lies," and at one point, a group of parents staged a protest directly outside Diane's home, their children holding up empty water jugs as symbols of what had been taken from them, their chants echoing down the street until Diane pulled her curtains shut and refused to come outside. Greg, for his part, tried to intimidate me directly one evening by walking down the gravel path toward my dock, his fists clenched and his face red with anger, but I didn't flinch. Standing tall with my camera phone already recording, I asked him if he'd like to explain on video why he was sneaking around the lake at midnight with containers of chemicals, and the way his face paled before he turned and stormed off told me everything I needed to know about how much pressure he was under. As the days turned into weeks, the test results came back, confirming everything my friend had initially told me, but with the full force of state authority. High concentrations of herbicides, solvents, and runoff chemicals that had absolutely no business being in a freshwater ecosystem. The levels far exceeding safe limits for human consumption, which meant that the HOA wasn't just guilty of harming the lake, but of actively endangering the health of every resident who relied on that water supply. The report was released publicly, and when it hit the local news again, the outrage turned into fury, neighbors openly talking about lawsuits, class actions, and even criminal charges, and while Diane tried one last desperate press release claiming that outside saboteurs had targeted the community, the release was immediately shredded by both investigators and reporters who pointed to the footage of her own board members as proof that the poison had come from within. It was in that chaotic week that I received a knock on my cabin door, and when I opened it, I found Emily, the young mother whose child had been hospitalized, standing there with tears in her eyes, clutching a pie tin in her hands. She stammered as she explained that she just wanted to thank me, that if I hadn't stood firm and gathered evidence, if I hadn't fought back when everyone else was too scared to question the HOA, her child might still be suffering without answers. And as she handed me that pie, still warm from the oven, I felt something shift inside me, a reminder that this battle wasn't just about my family's legacy or my right to fish. It was about protecting people who didn't know how to protect themselves from arrogance disguised as authority. That night, I sat on the dock with a slice of that pie and watched the moon reflect on the poisoned waters, thinking about how far we still had to go, but also knowing that the worst was behind us, because the truth had been dragged into daylight and no amount of spin or intimidation could bury it again. Still, I couldn't help but think about what the investigators had told me, that full restoration of the lake could take years, maybe even decades, depending on how deep the contamination had seeped into the soil and groundwater, and that while they could find the HOA, remove its board, and even bring criminal charges, Undoing the damage to nature itself would take patience, funding, and persistence, and as I sat there, I silently vowed that I would see it through, that I would dedicate myself to helping the lake recover no matter how long it took, because this place wasn't just a backdrop for human drama, it was a living entity that deserved better than what had been done to it. The war with the HOA had shown me the depths of their arrogance, but it had also shown me the resilience of truth. And as the cool night air rustled through the pines, I knew in my bones that Diane's reign was finished and the lake's long healing was just beginning. The day the HOA board was formally dissolved was one I'll never forget, because it wasn't some quiet bureaucratic announcement buried in paperwork. It was a full-blown community event that unfolded in front of everyone like a public reckoning, with state officials arriving at the clubhouse flanked by deputies, carrying thick binders of evidence and court orders that stripped Diane and her cronies of any legal authority over the neighborhood. The residents, many of whom had been tormented by arbitrary fines, harassment, and threats for years, gathered in droves on the grassy field across from the clubhouse, some holding handmade signs that read "Justice for the Lake" and "No more HOA tyranny," others just standing silently with arms crossed, their faces etched with satisfaction as they watched Diane emerge from the building pale and trembling, clutching a binder of her own as if it could somehow shield her from the reality that her reign was over. The deputies escorted her and Greg out in front of everyone, and while no one jeered or shouted, because the gravity of the moment was too powerful for pettiness, you could feel the electricity in the air, the shared understanding that monster had finally been unmasked and dethroned. Diane tried one last pathetic performance, telling a news crew that this was all a political hit job, that she and her board had acted in good faith. But the cameras captured her shaking hands and darting eyes, the hallmarks of someone who knew their lies had finally run out of road. And as she was led into a waiting car, a cheer broke out from the crowd, a cathartic release of years of frustration and fear that reverberated across the lake and into the woods beyond. In the days that followed, the state appointed a temporary water authority to oversee the restoration of the lake and the transition of a neighborhood away from HOA control, and the relief among residents was palpable, though it was tempered by the daunting reality of what lay ahead: rebuilding trust, repairing infrastructure, and most of all, healing the lake itself. Specialists arrived with boats outfitted with equipment to aerate the water, neutralize the worst of the chemicals, and begin the painstaking process of reviving aquatic life, but they warned us all in a town hall meeting that this wouldn't be quick or easy, that some of the fish species were likely gone for good, that the soil around the lake would need to be treated, and that the community would need to work together to avoid further contamination during the cleanup. I volunteered, immediately offering my dock as a staging point for their equipment and lending my hands to whatever grunt work needed doing, because after everything that had happened, I couldn't stand by and just watch anymore. This lake was in my blood, my family's history, and now it was my responsibility to help it heal. To my surprise, dozens of neighbors joined me, including people I'd never spoken to before. And together we formed an informal lake committee that met weekly to coordinate efforts, share updates, and keep pressure on the state to stay involved. Emily was there with her husband, bringing baked goods for volunteers, while old Mr. Jenkins, who had once been one of Diane's loudest enforcers, showed up with his pickup truck full of tools, muttering that he owed the lake an apology. And though I never fully trusted his motives, I still let him work alongside us, because this wasn't about grudges anymore. It was about collective healing. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community again, bound not by fear of fines or HOA letters, but by a shared mission to fix what had been broken. And as the weeks turned into months, I began to see subtle signs that the lake was responding, the water slowly regaining some of its clarity, birds cautiously returning to the shoreline, and the faint ripples of minnows darting in the shallows where once only death floated. Still, the scars of Diane's actions were everywhere, from the lawsuits piling up in the courts to the lingering medical issues reported by families who had unknowingly consumed the poisoned water. And though there was satisfaction in seeing her face splashed across the news with headlines about HOA corruption scandal and board charged in water poisoning case, there was also anger that it had taken so long, that so much suffering had been necessary before action was taken. 1. evening, as I sat on the dock with Emily and a few other committee members, we watched the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and pink, and she said something that stuck with me. They thought they were killing this place, but all they did was give us a reason to finally come together, and I realized she was right that in their arrogance, Diane and her board had underestimated the resilience of both the lake and the people who lived around it. Their attempt to choke off my fishing to control me through fear had backfired spectacularly, exposing their corruption, dismantling their power, and uniting a community that had long been fractured by their petty rules and oppressive fines. Now, instead of an HOA dictating what color people's shutters could be or how tall their grass was allowed to grow, we had neighbors meeting at the dock to discuss water testing schedules, fundraisers for restoration, and plans for the future. And though the work ahead was still immense, there was something profoundly hopeful about it. As the stars came out that night and the crickets began their steady chorus, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because the battle was fully won. It wasn't, but because for the first time, the lake's future wasn't in the hands of tyrants. It was in the hands of people who truly cared, and I silently promised myself that I would never let another Dian rise again. Not here. Not while I still had breath in my body. The final chapter of the lake saga didn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic arrests, but with something far quieter and infinitely more powerful renewal. And as the season cycled, I came to realize that justice wasn't just about watching Diane and her cronies face charges in court, though I admit there was satisfaction in hearing the judge declare that they would be fined heavily, barred from serving on any HOA boards again, and in some cases, even face prison time for environmental violations. But true justice was in the way the lake began to breathe again, in the way neighbors who once avoided eye contact were now rowing boats side by side to plant native grasses along the shoreline, in the way children's laughter returned to the water's edge where once their cries of pain and sickness had echoed. There was no overnight miracle. The fish didn't suddenly repopulate, nor did the water sparkle crystal clear like a postcard. But bit by bit, through countless volunteer hours, donations, and state-supported efforts, we watched life return. Frogs croaking in reeds, turtles sunning themselves on logs, herons gliding low across the surface in search of minnows that had once vanished. Every small sign of recovery felt like a victory not just for nature but for the spirit of the community, and I often caught myself sitting on the dock smiling as I saw families picnicking again, as if the poison that once seeped through the water had also seeped out of our hearts, leaving room for connection and resilience. Personally, I found myself transformed too. Before, my relationship with the lake had been mostly personal, rooted in nostalgia and my love of fishing. But after everything we endured, it became bigger than that. It became a symbol of resistance against arrogance and exploitation, and a reminder that when ordinary people band together, even the most entrenched corruption can be toppled. One particularly poignant moment came the day we held the Lake Rebirth Festival, a community-led event that replaced the HOA's old mandatory annual meeting. And instead of rule enforcement or fine collection, it was a celebration of what we'd overcome with live music, kids painting signs about protecting nature, a memorial for the wildlife we had lost, and even a ceremonial release of young fish into the water provided by the state's wildlife agency. As I stood watching those small flashes of silver dart into the shallows, I felt a lump in my throat, because I knew that while I might not live to see the lake fully restored to its former glory, I had been part of ensuring that future generations would, and that was enough for me. I remember Emily speaking at that festival, her voice clear and steady as she thanked everyone for fighting not just for clean water, but for her child's health, for their family's right to live without fear of invisible poison. And when she hugged me afterward, I felt the weight of every long night, every confrontation, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. It had all been worth it. Still, not everything was neatly tied with a bow, because even as Diane sat through her trial flanked by lawyers and stripped of the smugness she once wore like armor, there were lingering scars. The lawsuits dragged on. Some residents moved away, unable to forget what had happened, and the lake itself bore chemical shadows that would take years to fade. But in a way, that was part of the truth too. A reminder that damage once done cannot simply be erased. It must be acknowledged, worked through, and remembered so that it never happens again. For me, that meant continuing to serve on the lake committee long after the headlines faded, coordinating cleanups, keeping pressure on the county to maintain oversight, and yes, finally taking my fishing pole back out when the scientists declared it safe, though I no longer cared about the number of fish I caught. Each cast was less about the catch and more about honoring what had been saved, what had been fought for. I'd sit there with the line in the water, watching the sunset turn the lake gold, and think about my grandfather who had first taught me to fish here, about the way his hands had guided mine on the reel, and I like to believe that he would have been proud of me, not just for defending our right to fish, but for defending the water itself, for standing up against those who thought they could poison what belonged to everyone and get away with it. And so, in the end, the story of the HOA's attempt to control me by poisoning the lake became the story of their own downfall, because they had been blind to the simplest truth that you can't poison life without it coming back to choke you, that greed and arrogance always sow the seeds of their own destruction, and that water, like truth, always finds a way to surface. Now, whenever visitors come and ask me about the lake, I tell them it's recovering, that it's stronger than it looks, and I always end with the same quiet smile and the same thought. The HOA tried to kill my lake to stop me from fishing, but in doing so, they drowned themselves in their own corruption while the lake, stubborn and resilient, lived on, and so did we.